Queen Elizabeth I. Tonight, we are slipping into the life of a woman whose very name defines an age. A queen who refused to marry, ruled with iron patience, and turned doubt into legend. This is the story of Elizabeth Tudor, the monarch we remember as Queen Elizabeth I, whose reign reshaped England and still echoes through history. Before you settle in too deeply, take a moment, only if you feel like it, to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep creating these long, slow stories that carry you gently toward sleep. You are listening to Slumber Stories of the Past. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. Some people say these stories keep them awake because they are too interesting. Others drift off halfway through the first chapter. Either way, you are welcome here. Now, dim your lights, maybe put a fan on for a soft hum of white noise. Get comfortable and allow this story to unfold around you. Tonight, we walk quietly through the life, loves, and legends of the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth Tudor. The year is 1533, and Greenwich Palace is alive with careful tension. Servants move quickly through stone corridors. Courtiers murmur in side chambers. Outside, the Thames rolls past, wide and indifferent, as a kingdom waits. King Henry VIII is expecting news. His new wife, Anne Boleyn, is in labour. Henry is desperate for a son, a boy who will carry the Tudor name safely into the future. Anne is clever, bold, and ambitious, and her rise has already thrown the court into turmoil. When the baby is finally delivered on the 7th of September, a hush falls over the palace. The child is healthy. The child is strong. The child is not a son, a daughter, Elizabeth. The announcement is made with a quietness that speaks louder than celebration. Flags do not fly with the same joy they would have for a prince. A few smiles are forced into place. Some hearts sink. To many at court, this birth feels like a political disappointment. The longed-for heir has not arrived. But to Anne Boleyn, and to a small circle of those who dare to hope, the baby is cherished. The little girl has bright, reddish hair and a sharp, searching gaze. She carries her father's Tudor blood and her mother's fierce spirit. No one around her cradle can guess that this child, born into a wave of muttered regret, will one day command a kingdom and give her name to an entire era. Elizabeth's early years are shaped by instability. Before she is even 3 years old, her world is torn apart. Anne Boleyn, once the dazzling centre of the court, is arrested and taken to the Tower of London, accused of adultery, treason, and betrayal. Within days, she's executed by sword. The fall is swift and brutal. Her daughter is left behind, not as a princess, but as the child of a disgraced woman. Elizabeth is declared illegitimate. Her royal title is stripped away. The bright, glittering promises that surrounded her birth are replaced with a quieter, more uncertain existence in the countryside. She still lives in comfort. She is still of royal blood. But the air around her is different. She is watched more closely than she is held. Every move she makes is noticed, because she is no longer simply a king's daughter. She is a reminder of a queen who died under the blade. Henry VIII remarries again and again. Wives arrive with ceremony and hope, and some leave in disgrace or worse. From a distance, Elizabeth observes the patterns of favour and fear. She learns early that a king's love can turn to danger, and that power and affection are rarely safe companions. In this uncertain atmosphere, Elizabeth does something remarkable. She does not disappear into the background. She pays attention. Her education becomes one of her greatest protections. Henry may keep his distance emotionally, but he does not deny her the training of a royal child. The finest tutors are appointed, men who are scholars, linguists, and theologians. Elizabeth learns Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. She reads classical texts, letters of philosophers, histories of empires, and religious arguments that shape the politics of her age. She writes elegant letters in Latin, translates passages for practice, and absorbs language with unusual speed. Those who teach her notice a rare combination: a sharp mind, a disciplined memory, and a calm, serious presence. While other children might rebel, Elizabeth listens. She studies. She reflects. Her life has already shown her how quickly fortunes can turn. Her mother's death is not only a personal tragedy, it is a lesson about what happens when you stand too close to the flame of royal favour. So Elizabeth quietly begins to craft herself into something harder to break. Not simply a survivor of scandal, but a woman who knows how to read a room, hear what is left unsaid, and protect herself with restraint. She learns that sometimes silence is safer than protest, that observation can be more powerful than impulsive action, and that knowledge, once acquired, cannot easily be taken away. Deep inside, under every new language and every carefully chosen word, the first embers of a future queen glow quietly, waiting. As Elizabeth moves from childhood into youth, the court grows no less volatile. The wider world around her shifts with religion, alliances, and fear. Her half-brother Edward becomes king after Henry's death. He is young, sickly, and deeply Protestant. Under Edward, Elizabeth stays alert and cautious. She aligns herself with moderation, not fanaticism, and keeps her distance from plots that swirl in the background. When Edward dies and her half-sister Mary takes the throne, the atmosphere thickens even further. Mary, a devout Catholic, is suspicious of Protestants and deeply aware of how the succession has worked against her for most of her life. Elizabeth, as a prominent Protestant with a strong claim, becomes a focus of whispers. Rumours begin. Some say Elizabeth supports Protestant rebels. Others say she secretly hopes to take Mary's crown. In 1554, a rebellion against Mary breaks out, known as Wyatt's Rebellion. Whether Elizabeth is truly involved or not, her name is spoken often enough for it to matter. She is arrested and taken to the Tower of London. Now she walks through the same gates that once closed on her mother. The stone walls are the same. The cold, heavy air is the same. The knowledge of how easily death can fall within those walls is very real. For weeks, her future hangs by a thread. Elizabeth faces interrogations, suspicion, and the constant possibility of execution. Yet she does not collapse. She denies the accusations with great care. Her letters to Queen Mary are masterful. She pleads loyalty without sounding arrogant. She begs for mercy without appearing weak. Every sentence is weighed before it is written. She allows herself to weep when it is wise, and to appear composed when that is safer. She never rages publicly. She never openly blames. She simply endures. In those long, anxious days, she leans on something that has been quietly growing inside her since childhood. A steady sense of herself, and a deep understanding that showing too much emotion can be fatal in a world where appearances are judged before truth. Eventually, Mary does not order her death. Perhaps she fears public backlash. Perhaps she's not entirely convinced of Elizabeth's guilt. Perhaps she hesitates for personal reasons only she knows. Whatever the cause, Elizabeth is released from the tower. She leaves the place that killed her mother and nearly killed her, alive and unbroken. But she is not the same. She comes out not just as a princess who has survived danger, but as a woman forged in suspicion, sharpened by the knowledge that to live in this world, she must read every risk and protect herself with a mixture of charm, caution, and steel. Her time is approaching. The year is 1558. Queen Mary has died. The bells of London toll through streets that have grown weary of religious battles, executions, and uncertainty. The people turn their eyes to the next sovereign. Elizabeth Tudor, at just 25 years old, is now Queen of England. Her ride through London for the traditional pre-coronation procession is both symbolic and practical. She sits atop a white horse, riding beneath arches, past crowded streets where people press forward to see her. The November air is cool, carrying smoke from countless hearths. Londoners shout her name, toss their caps into the air, kneel in the mud, and hold their children up for a better view. Elizabeth smiles and nods, her face poised and serene. Inside, she knows exactly how fragile this moment is. England is religiously divided. The treasury is thin. Foreign powers look on, some with curiosity, some with hostility. Many in Europe doubt that a woman can rule effectively without a husband. Still, she has reached the place that her birth once seemed to deny her. She has the crown. Her coronation takes place on the 15th of January, 1559. She walks into Westminster Abbey, wearing robes that mix tradition with symbolism. She is anointed, crowned, and formally confirmed as monarch. From that day on, she carries a burden that few can grasp, the weight of an entire kingdom's future. One of her earliest tasks is to address the religious chaos that has torn the country apart. Henry broke from Rome. Edward leaned hard into Protestant reforms. Mary tried to bring Catholicism firmly back, burning Protestants at the stake. The nation is exhausted. Neighbours have turned against each other. Families are divided. Elizabeth knows that if she leans too far to one side, she risks rebellion and foreign intervention. Yet if she refuses to choose, she invites paralysis. She chooses a path that tries to hold a middle line. She re-establishes the Church of England and asserts her position as its supreme governor, but she avoids the extremes. She does not launch mass purges. She does not encourage wild revenge. She shapes a settlement that is Protestant in structure, but allows certain older practices to remain. Some are not satisfied. Hardline Catholics consider her illegitimate. Fierce Protestants want a more radical cleansing of ritual and imagery. But for many, this cautious compromise offers something rare in that age, a measure of peace. Elizabeth surrounds herself with men she trusts. William Cecil, calm, intelligent, and steady, becomes her chief advisor and remains so for decades. Francis Walsingham builds an extensive network of spies that helps protect her from plots and foreign intrigue. Nicholas Bacon and others help manage law and policy. These counsellors do not command her. They advise her, argue with her, and sometimes press her. But ultimately, the decisions are hers. Beneath the speeches and ceremonies, she knows something very clearly. Stability is the key to survival. The country must feel that someone is in control, and that this control will not swing wildly with the moods of the court. Which leads to the question that will follow her for most of her life. Marriage. From nearly the first days of her reign, ambassadors, courtiers, and Parliament ask the same thing. Whom will she marry? When will England gain an heir? Foreign princes present themselves as candidates on parchment and in person. Marriage to one of them could bring powerful alliances and protection. It could also bring foreign influence, religious pressure, and a loss of independence. At home, some suggest that she marry an English nobleman. That path brings dangers of its own. Any husband chosen from among her subjects could divide the nobility, lift one family above the rest, and threaten the balance she has worked to build. Elizabeth listens to the advice. She considers the proposals. Then she quietly shapes her answer. She does not say a simple no. She does not say yes. She draws out negotiations, sends polite responses, entertains the idea, then allows it to fade. At one point, she declares, in a line that will be remembered for centuries, that she is already bound to a husband, the Kingdom of England. She chooses to rule alone. In a time when nearly everyone expects a woman to define herself through marriage, she makes that expectation work for her, instead of against her. She turns her unmarried state into a symbol. Among the men closest to her, one name stands out: Robert Dudley. Handsome, charming, and witty, Dudley has known Elizabeth since childhood. He becomes one of her most trusted companions and a favourite at court. Their closeness attracts immediate interest and constant gossip. When his wife, Amy Robsart, dies in circumstances that appear suspicious to some, rumours explode. Whispers suggest that Dudley and Elizabeth planned her death so they could marry. Whether this is true or not, one thing becomes clear to Elizabeth. Marrying him would damage her reputation and destabilise her rule. She does not take that step. She does not marry anyone. Over the years, suitors come and go. Philip II of Spain, the Archduke Charles of Austria, Francis, Duke of Anjou, and others. Each represents an option, and each is kept at arm's length. Elizabeth uses the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool. She allows foreign powers to hope, keeps negotiations alive just long enough to secure concessions, and then lets the conversation cool. At home, her unmarried state makes some people nervous. Without a clear heir, the future after her death looks uncertain. plots and predictions orbit around that unknown. Elizabeth feels the pressure, but she weighs it against what she has seen all her life. Marriage can entangle a queen in her husband's ambitions. It can make her a partner when she needs to stand alone. It can weaken her authority in the eyes of those who already doubt her. She chooses her crown over any husband. Instead of being embarrassed by the absence of a spouse, she shapes an image from it. She becomes the Virgin Queen. Painters begin to show her as more than a ruler. She is wrapped in pearls, framed by symbols of purity, power, and divine favour. In some portraits, she almost looks otherworldly, more like an idea than a person. Elizabeth leans into this. If she does not belong to a man, she belongs to her country. She is both monarch and symbol. Her court reflects this carefully managed image. It is a place of politics, certainly, but also of culture and performance. At Whitehall, Richmond, and other royal residences, the great halls glitter with fabrics and colours. Courtiers arrive in velvet and lace, with ruffled collars and finely embroidered sleeves. The service is rich and bright. Beneath it, everyone is playing a game. Every bow, every joke, every compliment is a move designed to gain or keep favour. The Queen's gaze is the prize. To be noticed by her can change a family's fortune. To be ignored, or worse, to be dismissed, can end a career. Elizabeth is not a passive audience. She enjoys this theatre. She encourages music, dance, plays, and elaborate pageants. She knows that pageantry is not a distraction from power. It is a form of power. Poets such as Edmund Spenser write in her honour. He calls her Gloriana in The Fairy Queen, blending myth and monarchy. Artists paint her with suns, globes, and symbols of eternal youth. And in London's growing theatre scene, a playwright named William Shakespeare begins crafting stories that explore ambition, betrayal, loyalty, and the rise and fall of rulers. His work grows under the stability of her reign, even if he is not constantly at her personal court. The court, however, is not a safe paradise. It is filled with rivalry and hidden danger. Elizabeth rewards men she trusts with titles, land, and influence. Robert Dudley, Walter Raleigh, and Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, are each raised high at different times. She loves wit and courage, but she also expects loyalty and obedience. When any of them forget that they serve at her pleasure, she is capable of bringing them back down swiftly. Her closest counsellors, such as William Cecil, remain steady for decades. They help her balance the restless energies of younger favourites with the needs of the state. Through it all, she rarely shows public weakness. Even when tired or ill, she presents herself as controlled and composed. Her dresses grow more elaborate, her wigs more towering, her white lead makeup thicker, but every detail is part of a chosen image. She understands that in a dangerous world, a monarch cannot afford to look fragile, so she creates a version of herself that can stand above gossip, above faction, above the ordinary flow of time. Behind that carefully crafted mask, she feels and grieves like any person. But the world rarely sees that side. Her rule is an ongoing performance, and she plays her part with unmatched skill. Yet, for all the play of light at court, the greatest threats to Elizabeth do not come from flirtations or poems. They come from blood and belief. One of the most serious dangers lives in the form of another queen, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary is Elizabeth's cousin, Catholic, once Queen of Scotland, and briefly Queen Consort of France. To many Catholics in England and across Europe, Mary's claim to the English throne appears stronger than Elizabeth's, because they do not accept Henry's break from Rome or Elizabeth's birth as legitimate. After turmoil in Scotland, Mary flees to England in 1568, expecting support from Elizabeth. Instead, she is held under a kind of luxurious arrest. She stays in castles and manor houses with attendants and comforts. But she is never truly free. For nearly 19 years, Mary's presence in England is a constant source of unease. Plots form around her. Letters are smuggled in and out. Some conspirators dream of killing Elizabeth and placing Mary on the throne. Elizabeth hesitates to act against her cousin. She believes deeply in the idea that monarchs are appointed by God. The execution of a queen by another queen feels like a dangerous line to cross, both in theology and in politics. Still, the conspiracies do not stop. In 1586, one plot pushes matters too far. The Babington plot, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and free Mary, is uncovered. Thanks to Walsingham's spy network, letters are intercepted and decoded. Within those letters, Mary appears to give approval to the plan. Now, Elizabeth faces a choice that she has tried to avoid for almost 2 decades. After long hesitation and in a conflict, a death warrant is prepared and signed. Whether she fully intended it to be carried out so quickly remains debated by historians, but the outcome is clear. On the 8th of February, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, is executed at Fotheringhay Castle. She appears dressed in red, a colour associated with Catholic martyrdom. The event shocks Europe. To some, it confirms Elizabeth as a ruthless heretic. To others, it looks like a harsh necessity. For Elizabeth herself, the moment leaves a mark. She retreats from public life for a time, insisting that the execution was carried out without her final consent. Whether this is political cover or a genuine emotional reaction, the effect is the same. She has removed her most dangerous rival, but at a deep personal cost. Barely a year later, another test arrives, not in letters or secret meetings, but in the form of a fleet. The long tension between Protestant England and Catholic Spain finally erupts into a direct military confrontation. King Philip II of Spain, once married to Elizabeth's sister Mary, and long an opponent of Elizabeth's religious policies, launches an enormous naval force against England. More than 130 Spanish ships, carrying thousands of soldiers and sailors, set out in what is known as the Spanish Armada. On paper, Spain has the advantage. More ships, more men, and greater resources. England's navy is smaller and less heavily armed. The situation is serious. Elizabeth's response is firm. She travels to Tilbury to address her assembled troops. There, in armour over a white gown, she delivers the famous speech in which she acknowledges that she has the body of a weak and feeble woman, but claims the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England. The words steady her soldiers and reinforce her image as a leader who does not shrink from danger. At sea, English ships take advantage of their speed and maneuverability. They harry the Spanish formation, use fire ships to break their tight defensive crescent near Calais, and keep pressure on the Armada as it tries to regroup. Then the weather intervenes. Storms lash the Spanish ships as they attempt to circle around Scotland and Ireland to return home. Many vessels are wrecked on harsh coastlines. Disease and starvation take a heavy toll. By the time what is left of the Armada limps back to Spain, roughly half the ships are gone. England has survived. The invasion has failed. The defeat of the Spanish Armada is more than a strategic victory. It becomes a powerful symbol. Paintings show Elizabeth with her hand resting on a globe, standing over depictions of broken ships. She is presented as the calm centre of a nation that has faced down a mighty empire and endured. Of course, the victory is due to a mix of strategy, seamanship, and weather. But in the minds of her people, it connects directly to their queen. Her image as Gloriana, the shining figure at the heart of a new age, grows even stronger. The years that follow bring both glory and strain. England expands its presence on the seas. Trade grows. The arts flourish. At the same time, the costs of war and defence strain the royal finances. Elizabeth herself ages. By the 1590s, she is no longer the young queen riding a white horse through cheering streets. She is a woman in her 50s and 60s, carrying decades of responsibility. Her most trusted counsellors begin to die. William Cecil passes away after a long life of service. Robert Dudley, her closest companion, and perhaps the man she loved more than any other, dies suddenly in 1588, soon after the Armada's defeat. When news of Dudley's death reaches her, she reportedly shuts herself away, refusing food and comfort, grieving alone. New faces rise at court, eager for influence. Some, like Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, capture her attention for a time. Essex is brave, impulsive, and less cautious than the stable figures of earlier years. He enjoys her favour, but mishandles military campaigns and overestimates his own importance. In 1601, in a desperate attempt to regain lost power, he leads a small and poorly supported rebellion in London. Elizabeth is forced to respond. Essex is arrested, tried, and executed for treason. Once again, she signs a death warrant for a man she once cherished. Economically, the kingdom feels the pressure of long conflict. Prices rise. Discontent simmers beneath the surface. Yet, despite the difficulties, Elizabeth retains a deep reservoir of affection among her people. They see her as a symbol of the nation's endurance. She has been their queen for so long that many cannot remember a time without her. In her final years, she grows more cautious about naming a successor. To acknowledge too clearly who will follow her seems, in her view, to weaken her own authority while she still lives. So she keeps her thoughts close. She continues to appear in public, though less often, in her heavy gowns, white makeup, and carefully styled wigs. She maintains the appearance of strength, even as her body grows more fragile. She understands that her image is part of England's stability. As long as she appears unshaken, the realm feels steady. By early 1603, Elizabeth is 69 years old and nearing the end of her long reign. She withdraws more frequently to quieter residences like Richmond Palace. Those who serve her notice changes. She eats less. She grows thinner. She spends long periods sitting in silence, lost in thought beneath windows that look out over the river and the grey English sky. When her counsellors urge her to rest in bed, she reportedly refuses, saying that must is not a word to use to princes. Even in her final days, she clings to her sense of autonomy. Eventually, it appears that she signals her acceptance of James VI of Scotland as her successor. James is the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the cousin she once sent to the block. The wheel of history has turned full circle. On the 24th of March, 1603, Elizabeth dies, likely in her sleep. News spreads quickly through London. Church bells ring in sombre tones. Black cloth goes up on doors and over streets. People gather to mourn not just a monarch, but the end of a dynasty. The Tudor line ends with her. Yet something larger than blood continues. Elizabeth's legend does not fade. If anything, it grows brighter as time passes. She is remembered not as the elderly woman who spent long nights deep in thought, but as the queen who stood against Spain, who presided over Shakespeare's age, who turned her unmarried status into a symbol of devotion to her country. History gives her many names: Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the mother of her people. Beneath the titles, there is a life that began in scandal, moved through fear and imprisonment, and rose into one of the most storied reigns in English history. She was born a disappointment to many, a daughter where a son was expected. She grew up under the shadow of her mother's execution, survived the Tower as a suspected traitor, and wore the crown in a world that doubted a woman's right to rule alone. Yet she ruled for 44 years. In the end, you could say that England was, in a sense, her chosen partner, and the age that bears her name, her legacy. She loved her kingdom fiercely, guarded it jealously, and left it changed. Her voice is long silent, yet the echoes of her decisions, her image, and her story still ripple quietly through time. The medicine of ancient Egypt. Long before the glow of electric lights, long before hospitals filled with sterile tools and quiet machines, people living along the banks of the Nile practiced a form of healing that blended the physical, the spiritual, and the eternal. In ancient Egypt, health was not simply a matter of the body. It was a state of harmony between a person, the gods, and the unseen forces that surrounded everyday life. To become ill was not only to suffer physically, it was to fall out of balance, to be touched by divine displeasure or spiritual disturbance. And so healing became a sacred act. In the warm, golden light of this civilization, temples served not only as places of worship, but as the earliest hospitals. Their tall stone columns, painted ceilings, and drifting incense created an atmosphere that felt close to the divine. Within these quiet halls, priest-physicians tended to the sick. They listened to their complaints, touched their foreheads, and whispered prayers meant to restore order to the body and the soul. The gods were never far from the healing process. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, was believed to have recorded the foundations of medicine itself. Sekhmet, the fierce lioness goddess, could bring plague when angered, but could also take sickness away if soothed. To call upon a god during treatment was not superstition. It was considered an essential part of healing. Yet for all their reverence for the spiritual, the Egyptians were also practical, observant, and deeply attentive to the physical world. They treated wounds with wine or clean Nile water, understanding that cleansing a cut mattered. They used herbs, oils, and minerals to soothe pain or reduce swelling. Their knowledge grew from generations of observation, experimentation, and careful record keeping on fragile papyrus scrolls. Life in ancient Egypt was filled with danger. Crocodiles lurked in the river. Sandstorms swept across the desert. Sickness, infections, and injuries came easily in such a landscape. But alongside danger, there was beauty and discipline. People bathed often to maintain purity. They used ointments not only to soften skin, but to protect against the harsh climate. They honoured the body as a gift from the gods. In this world, medicine was not simply a way to survive. It was a way to maintain sacred order. It existed at the crossroads of science and faith, of the physical and the spiritual. To heal a person was to restore them to the balance of the universe itself. In the heart of this civilization stood a unique figure, the Sunu, the physician priest. These healers did not see themselves as mere practitioners of remedies. They walked between two worlds, interpreters of divine intention and keepers of medical knowledge. They wore linen robes instead of white coats. They carried amulets, scrolls, and sacred symbols rather than metal instruments. Their connection to the gods was as important as their understanding of herbs or anatomy. Thoth was called upon whenever healing began. His wisdom was believed to guide the hands of the healer, but no deity inspired more awe than Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess. She was a force of both destruction and protection. If she was angered, plague swept across the land. If she was comforted, illness retreated. Her priests memorized entire libraries of rituals designed to invoke her healing aspect while calming her fierce nature. At times, healing began not with medicine, but with dreams. Patients rested in temple chambers, hoping that during sleep a god might reveal the cause of their ailment or whisper the cure through symbolic visions. Yet divine guidance was only one pillar of Egyptian healing. The other came from knowledge passed through centuries. Among the earliest figures to shape this knowledge was Imhotep, a man who lived around 2600 BCE. Architect, scholar, and physician, he was so skilled that centuries after his death, he was worshipped as a god of healing. Temples dedicated to him welcomed the sick, who believed his spirit would guide their recovery. Being a healer in Egypt meant understanding that illness was never just physical. It was a disturbance in the grand pattern of life. To restore someone was to restore balance. Every remedy, every prayer, every ritual was an attempt to align the visible and invisible parts of existence. Hidden deep within temple storerooms, where the dry air slowed decay, papyrus scrolls preserved the medical knowledge of generations. Among these writings, one stands out as a monumental record of early healing, The Ebers Papyrus. Written more than 3,500 years ago, this scroll stretches more than 65 feet when fully unrolled. Written in flowing hieratic script, it contains over 700 remedies, magical incantations, and observations about the human body. It reads like both a medical textbook and a spiritual guide. Within its lines, healers recorded treatments for eye infections, digestive troubles, hair loss, fevers, and wounds. It documents remedies for asthma, advising patients to inhale vapors from heated herbs placed upon stones. It even describes a condition resembling diabetes, noting excessive thirst and frequent urination. Proof that Egyptian physicians recognized chronic illness long before modern terms existed. But the papyrus is not merely scientific. It carries spells meant to activate the potency of a medicine or to expel a spiritual cause of disease. A healer might prepare an herbal mixture and speak a sacred phrase as it was applied. To the Egyptians, the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was thin, and both were needed for true healing. One of the most intriguing ideas found in the Ebers Papyrus is the concept of the metu, channels or vessels through which air, blood, and other vital forces flowed. Although not anatomically accurate by modern standards, the concept shows a desire to understand how the body circulated life. It hints at an early understanding that health required proper flow and balance. The papyrus was likely studied in temple schools. It may have been unrolled and rewound countless times by physician priests learning their craft. Even now, thousands of years later, the document remains a bridge to the ancient world, revealing both the wisdom and the wonder with which Egyptians approached medicine. Despite their reliance on ritual and divine support, Egyptian healers were far from passive. They treated physical injuries with steady hands and practical skill. When someone suffered a cut, the healer washed the wound with wine or water to remove impurities. Honey was often applied as a natural antiseptic. Today we know honey contains antibacterial properties, but the Egyptians discovered its benefits long before microscopes existed. Soft linen bandages were wrapped carefully to protect the injury. For broken bones, splints made from wood or reeds were secured with strips of cloth. Dislocated joints were eased back into place using oils that reduced friction and pain. Swelling could be soothed with cool compresses made from crushed plants or minerals. Burns were treated with mixtures of milk, honey, and clay to draw out heat and prevent infection. Even abscesses and infected wounds were drained or cleaned using bronze or obsidian tools, instruments that were sterilized with heat or alcohol. Though internal surgery was rare, simple operations were performed when needed. Cauterization was used to stop bleeding or disinfect deep wounds, often accompanied by prayers meant to seal the injury on a spiritual level as well as a physical one. Pain relief was achieved with natural sedatives. Mandrake root, poppy extract, and certain fermented beverages helped calm patients during uncomfortable procedures. The healer's presence mattered as much as the medicine itself. They worked slowly, methodically, offering reassurance as they treated the injured. In these moments, the sacred and practical met seamlessly. Their actions show a civilization that understood healing as both science and art. Magic was also a treatment, not a symbol, but an essential tool within Egyptian medicine. Illness, to the ancient mind, could be caused by angered spirits, curses, or invisible forces. Medicines addressed the body, but magic addressed the unseen. Healers recited spells rhythmically, believing the sound itself carried power. Incantations called upon protective gods such as Isis or Bez, a household deity who guarded children and the vulnerable. These chants were considered part of the remedy, not separate from it. Amulets played an important role as well. Crafted from gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, or carved stone, these charms were placed around the patient's neck or beneath wrappings. The scarab symbol represented rebirth and transformation. The Eye of Horus offered protection and restoration. The Ankh symbolized life and vitality. A healer might apply a remedy and tuck an amulet beneath a bandage to reinforce the spiritual aspect of recovery. For certain treatments, the ritual was even more elaborate. A healer might write a sacred name on papyrus and burn it, letting the smoke carry the cure upward. In other cases, the patient would drink water infused with ink from magical inscriptions, believing the power of the words would enter their body. Symbols could be painted on the skin or circles drawn around the patient to block hostile forces. Even the preparation of medicines sometimes began with spells recited over ingredients to awaken their potency. To the Egyptian healer, the mind, body, and spirit were inseparable. One could not be healed while the others remained out of balance. Magic was the link that connected them. Herbal medicine formed the backbone of Egyptian healing. The land itself provided countless remedies. Along the Nile and in nearby deserts, plants grew that could soothe, strengthen, or purify. Aloe vera, for example, was used to cool burns. Egyptians applied its thick gel directly to the skin, recognizing its ability to hydrate and ease discomfort. Myrrh, harvested from desert trees, served as a powerful antiseptic. It was mixed into salves for wounds or brewed to soothe sore throats. Its significance was both medicinal and spiritual, often burned in temples as incense. Willow bark, rich in the natural precursor to aspirin, helped reduce pain and inflammation. Though Egyptians lacked chemical analysis, they recognized that chewing or boiling the bark relieved aching joints or headaches. Coriander, cumin, garlic, and juniper berries helped digestion. Fenugreek eased coughs. Licorice root soothed the throat and sweetened herbal mixtures. Honey appeared everywhere, not only for its sweetness, but for its ability to moisturize, preserve, and fight infection. Milk and beer, both staple drinks, often acted as carriers for powdered herbs or crushed minerals. Oils were used to soften the skin, massage aching bodies, or warm, stiff muscles. Some remedies used animal parts, crocodile fat, snake skins, or insects, but these ingredients were balanced with prayers or symbolic rituals. Every substance carried meaning as well as function. The Egyptian healer did not separate the practical from the sacred. Nature was both pharmacy and temple. Diagnosing illness involved more than identifying symptoms. It required understanding why the patient became ill at that moment in their life. a healer examined the body with care, noting temperature, skin colour, tongue appearance, breathing patterns and posture. They inspected urine, stool and sweat, paying attention to colour or smell. The pulse was felt not as a rhythm to be counted, but as an energy pattern, revealing tension or stagnation. However, the healer also asked questions that reached deeper. They explored the patient's emotional state, recent experiences, dreams, and relationships. They considered whether a god might be displeased, whether a curse had been cast, or whether the spirit had been disturbed. Dream interpretation played a major role. Books of dreams were consulted. If someone dreamt of falling, it might signal loss of protection. If they dreamt of drowning, it might reflect emotional overwhelm. Temples often offered special chambers for dream incubation, where patients slept, hoping for divine guidance. Some healers used divination. They drew symbols in sand, observed the movement of birds, or cast small bones to interpret subtle messages from the divine world. Mental distress, visions, confusion, sudden sadness was often interpreted as spiritual possession. Curing such afflictions required both herbs and incantations, soothing the body while commanding the invading force to leave. Diagnosis in ancient Egypt was a story. The healer's job was to follow the thread back to its source, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual. Death, though feared, was seen as another stage of existence, not an ending. And just as physicians cared for the living, embalmers and priests prepared the dead with techniques that were, in their way, a final act of healing. Mummification was a 70-day ritual designed to preserve the body so the spirit could recognize it in the afterlife. It began with cleansing the body using water from the Nile and fragrant palm wine. The internal organs were removed carefully. The stomach, lungs, liver, and intestines were placed into canopic jars, each guarded by a protective deity. The heart, seat of memory and emotion, was usually left inside, or, in rare cases, replaced with a scarab amulet. The brain, misunderstood in function but acknowledged as soft and perishable, was removed through the nose using a metal hook. The body was then packed with natron salt for 40 days, drying it until only durable tissue remained. After this period, embalmers wrapped the limbs and torso with hundreds of yards of linen. Spells were written on some strips. Resin sealed each layer. Amulets were tucked between the wrappings to protect the spirit. The opening of the mouth ritual restored symbolic ability to speak, breathe, and eat in the afterlife. Once wrapped and anointed, the mummy was placed in a carved sarcophagus and housed within a tomb stocked with goods for the soul's journey. For the Egyptians, mummification was not preservation for vanity, but preservation for eternity, a final form of medicine to safeguard the spirit. Although millennia have passed, the influence of Egyptian healing has not disappeared. Many of their discoveries travelled across ancient trade routes into Greek and Roman medicine. Physicians such as Hippocrates and Galen built upon Egyptian observations about anatomy, hygiene, and herbal treatments. Even today, elements of their pharmacology remain. Honey as an antiseptic, willow bark for pain, garlic for heart health, These remedies echo ancient practices supported now by scientific research. But the Egyptians also left a philosophical legacy. They believed healing required attention to every part of a person's being. The physical body mattered, but so did emotion, thought, and spirit. Illness had meaning. Treatment required patience, presence, and intention. In modern clinics, a quiet trace of Egyptian wisdom remains whenever a nurse holds a patient's hand, whenever a doctor listens to someone's fears, whenever a healer acknowledges that people seek not only treatment, but reassurance. Medicine is still part science, part art. The world of ancient Egypt may be silent now, its temples worn by wind and sand, but the heartbeat of its healing tradition still resonates. In every act of care, there is a faint echo of those first physician priests who understood that to heal someone is to honor their life. The city cut in two, Berlin and the wall. In the spring of 1945, Berlin was no longer a proud capital. It was a shattered skeleton of a city, scarred by years of bombing and street fighting. Buildings that had once held concerts and banquets now stood as hollow shells. Streets that once bustled with trams and shoppers were filled with rubble, twisted metal, and quiet, drifting dust. The war in Europe was ending, but what followed was not simple peace. The victors gathered to decide what to do with the broken remains of Germany and its ruined capital. The United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union and France had fought on the same side against Nazi Germany. But beneath that alliance, their visions for the future could not have been more different. Germany was carved into 4 zones of occupation, each controlled by one of the 4 powers. Berlin, although deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. One city, split like a circle into slices, each administered by a different foreign power. At first, there were gestures of cooperation. The goal, at least on paper, was stability and reconstruction. But slowly, almost quietly at first, disagreement hardened into suspicion. In the Western zones, the Americans, British, and French encouraged democratic institutions, free elections, and private business. They hoped to rebuild a prosperous, Western-aligned Germany. In the East, the Soviet Union dismantled factories, removed machinery, and installed a tightly controlled socialist government. The division was not just political. It seeped into every corner of life. West Berlin began to fill with signs of Western culture, shop windows, jazz records, American newspapers. East Berlin carried banners of socialist slogans, ration cards, and strict party control. For a time, the border within the city remained open. People could cross from one side to the other on foot, by tram, by train. A single street might mark the line between 2 systems. A person could buy coffee in the West and walk home to an apartment in the East. But beneath this fluid movement, pressure built. In 1948, when the Western powers introduced a new currency in their zones to stabilize the economy, the Soviet Union saw it as a threat. In response, they blocked all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin. Overnight, the city's western sectors were cut off from supplies. Rather than surrender, the Western Allies launched the Berlin airlift. Day and night, cargo planes landed one after another, delivering food, fuel, and medicine. At its peak, a plane touched down every few minutes. For almost a year, West Berlin survived on what arrived from the sky. When the blockade finally ended, the message was clear. Berlin was no longer just a place on a map. It had become a symbol, a fault line between two rival visions of the world. As months turned into years, the division deepened. On one side stood the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, aligned with the West. On the other, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, tied closely to Moscow. Berlin sat at the center of this new Cold War. In West Berlin, life slowly began to resemble that of other Western cities. Cafes, cinemas, and department stores opened their doors. New housing projects rose from the ruins. Bright shop signs and neon lights hinted at a return to normal life. In East Berlin, life was more tightly controlled. The government managed the economy, monitored the press, and suppressed opposition. Political dissent was met with intimidation, prison, or exile. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, expanded into a vast network of informants and surveillance. Yet between these two worlds, the internal border in Berlin remained relatively porous. People who lived in the east could still take a train to the west, find work, visit family, or simply walk through parks and streets that looked and felt different from their own neighborhoods. This freedom had consequences. From the late 1940s through the 1950s, millions of East Germans left the country, many of them slipping through Berlin. Teachers, doctors, engineers, and young students crossed into West Berlin and then flew or travelled further into the Federal Republic. It was a slow-motion exodus that threatened the stability of the East German state. The government in the East grew desperate. They saw their own citizens leaving not only as a loss of workers, but as a blow to their claim that socialism offered a better life. Every person who crossed the border and did not return was a silent criticism. Tension grew thicker each year. The West accused the East of imprisoning its people. The East accused the West of stealing its citizens and undermining its society. And all the while, Berlin remained the place where these competing realities touched. A line had been drawn in the mind. Soon, it would be drawn in stone. In the early hours of August 13th, 1961, while most people slept, the streets of East Berlin filled with soldiers, police, and construction crews. Trucks rumbled over cobblestones. Rolls of barbed wire were pulled taut across roads, squares, and train lines. Residents looked out their windows to see barriers rising where the night before there had been nothing but junctions, pavements, and tram tracks. Commuters who expected to cross into West Berlin for work found streets blocked and armed guards in their way. It did not begin as a concrete wall. At first it was fences, coils of wire, makeshift obstacles. But the meaning was unmistakable. The open border was closed. The East German government described this as a defensive measure, a protective barrier against Western aggression and fascist influences. In reality, it was a way to stop people from leaving. Shock spread quickly. Some people tried to flee on that very first day, pushing past fences, jumping from windows on buildings that stood right at the border, straight into the arms of West Berlin firefighters and police below. Some made it. Others were injured or pulled back by guards. Within days, the temporary barriers hardened into something more permanent. Concrete slabs rose up, sealing off streets that once flowed naturally from one side of the city to the other. Windows on border buildings were bricked up. Train tracks that crossed sectors were cut and ended abruptly. Checkpoints were established, including one that would become famous under a simple name, Checkpoint Charlie. Here, at a single crossing point, American and Soviet tanks would one day face each other in a tense standoff, barrels pointing toward one another, watched by a world holding its breath. The barrier surrounding West Berlin stretched for almost 100 miles, encircling the city centre like a ring. Guard towers appeared, spaced out along the length of the border. Searchlights swept across the death strip, a bare zone between inner and outer walls, cleared of obstacles that might provide cover to anyone trying to escape. The message could not have been clearer. A city had been divided not just by ideology, but by concrete. Daily life on either side of the wall evolved along separate paths. In West Berlin, people continued to live under the protection of Western powers, surrounded by East German territory. The city became a kind of display window for capitalism and democracy. Western newspapers, fashion and music flowed through the streets. Cafes and clubs filled with students, artists and writers. American troops remained stationed there, a visible reminder that the city would not be abandoned. Yet West Berlin was also an island accessible by special corridors through East Germany, always aware of the concrete border that cut through neighbourhoods and hearts. For many residents, the wall was never far away, a grey backdrop at the end of certain streets, a reminder that freedom here ended sharply at a line of stone. In East Berlin, life unfolded under the gaze of the state. There were jobs, subsidised housing, and social benefits, but there was also heavy censorship, political pressure, and constant observation. The Stasi maintained one of the most extensive surveillance networks in the world. Neighbours reported on neighbours, sometimes willingly, sometimes under duress. People learned to speak differently in public and in private, saving their honest thoughts for trusted circles, if they dared to share them at all. Children born after 1961 grew up never having seen the other half of their own city. For them, the wall was simply part of the landscape, a grim horizon that had always been there. Families were split. Some parents were on one side, grown children on the other. Grandparents could no longer visit grandchildren. Lovers found themselves locked in separate worlds overnight. Phone lines were cut. Letters opened and censored. Visits heavily restricted or forbidden entirely. The division did not only mark territory, it cut through relationships, memories, and futures. Even under these conditions, people continued to dream of escape. From the very first days of the wall, attempts to cross it began and never completely stopped. Some were hasty and desperate, like those who jumped from buildings into nets, held by West Berlin rescue workers before windows could be sealed. Others were meticulously planned over months or years. Groups of students and workers quietly dug tunnels beneath the wall, hauling out earth in buckets and hiding it in attics, basements, or gardens. Some tunnels collapsed. Others succeeded, guiding dozens of people at a time into freedom. Families engineered homemade hot air balloons stitched together from scraps of fabric, trusting cloth, flame and wind to carry them across the border. A few of these fragile vessels floated safely into West German territory, landing in fields where their passengers stumbled out in disbelief. Cars were modified with hidden compartments under seats or inside false panels. Drivers kept their faces calm at checkpoints, while anxious passengers lay breathless in the dark, inches away from armed guards. Others tried to swim across rivers and canals marking the border. Cold water, currents, and patrols made these attempts extremely risky. Some succeeded. Many did not. It is estimated that more than 5,000 people escaped across or through the wall during its existence. At least 140 lost their lives in the attempt, shot by border guards, drowned in rivers, or killed by mines. Among the most remembered stories is that of Peter Fechter, an 18-year-old who tried to climb the wall in 1962. He was shot and fell back into the death strip, where he lay in full view of those on both sides, crying out for help. No guards dared cross the line to assist him. He bled to death where he fell. Stories like his spread around the world, becoming symbols of the human cost of division. Not everyone could attempt escape. For many in East Berlin, leaving loved ones or risking their lives was unthinkable. But staying did not mean surrendering completely. Acts of resistance took quieter, more subtle forms. Writers and poets smuggled manuscripts to the West under false names or hidden among other goods. Their words, banned at home, were printed in Western newspapers or broadcast back into East Germany over radio waves. People tuned into Western broadcasts in secret, turning the volume down, closing curtains, listening to music and news they were not supposed to hear. The simple act of listening became a private statement of independence. Churches, especially Protestant congregations, became gathering places for reflection, discussion, and, eventually, organized dissent. In these spaces, shielded slightly from the state's gaze, people could speak more freely about their frustrations, their hopes, and their desire for change. Artists embedded criticism in metaphors, paintings, and songs. Graffiti appeared in risky places. Jokes circulated quietly, making fun of officials in ways that could not be spoken aloud in public. In West Berlin and beyond, solidarity movements emerged. Activists sent literature, equipment, and support. Musicians held concerts near the wall, letting their performances carry across the barrier. In 1987, at a concert close to the border, David Bowie sang Heroes to an audience that included East Berliners listening from the other side. For many, hearing those words drift over the wall felt like a reminder that the world had not forgotten them. Resistance did not always look like dramatic escape attempts. Sometimes it was a candle held in a crowd, a leaflet passed hand to hand, or a whispered conversation shared in the quiet of a kitchen. By the mid-1980s, the ground beneath the entire Eastern Bloc began to shift. In the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced policies known as glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, efforts to reform a system that was struggling under economic stagnation and public dissatisfaction. These changes sent ripples through the countries under Soviet influence. East German leaders, however, resisted reform. They insisted that their system would remain unchanged. But information travels, even through cracks. Citizens saw and heard that change was possible elsewhere. They noticed when other countries adjusted, loosened restrictions, or opened borders. In 1989, Hungary began cutting its border fences with Austria. A new path opened quietly from east to west. Thousands of East Germans travelled to Hungary on holiday and then slipped into Austria and on to West Germany. Images of these travellers, suitcases in hand, smiling as they crossed former barriers, circulated widely. Back in East Germany, protests grew. People gathered in cities like Leipzig, first in churches for prayers and meetings, then spilling into the streets for peaceful marches. They carried candles instead of weapons and chanted, "Wir sind das Volk, we are the people." Week after week, the crowds grew larger. The government watched uneasily, torn between fear of losing control and fear of provoking bloodshed. The world, now accustomed to images from live television, saw these gatherings and wondered if violence would follow, as it had in other uprisings. But the protests did not fade. They spread. The government tried to offer minor concessions, but they came too late and with too little trust. Something had begun that could not easily be reversed. Then, in November 1989, a press conference changed history. During a confusing announcement about new travel regulations, an East German official stated, incorrectly, that citizens would be allowed to cross the border immediately. He did not intend to open the gates at once, but that is how his words were understood. The statement broadcast across television and radio. People heard what they had longed to hear. The border is open. That evening, thousands of East Berliners walked, cycled, and drove toward the wall. They carried passports, children, questions, and a cautious kind of hope. At checkpoints like Bornholmer Strasse, border guards found themselves confronted by growing crowds. People demanded to be let through. The guards had no clear orders. Phone calls to superiors brought no firm instructions. Confusion thickened. The officers faced an impossible choice. If they opened fire, they risked triggering a disaster in front of the world's cameras. If they refused to let people pass, the situation might escalate in another way. And all the while, more citizens arrived, filling the streets with voices and restless energy. Finally, at 10:45 p.m., one senior officer at Bornholmer Strasse made a decision. He ordered the barrier raised. The crowd surged forward. People laughed, cried, embraced strangers. They poured into West Berlin, where residents were already waiting with flowers, drinks, and open arms. Soon, checkpoints all along the city followed, some reluctantly, some simply overwhelmed. The wall that had defined life for 28 years did not fall with an explosion or a single command. It opened almost hesitantly under the pressure of thousands of footsteps. People climbed onto the wall itself, balancing along its cold top, raising their arms in celebration. Others chipped away at the concrete with hammers and chisels, breaking off fragments to keep as pieces of history. There were no tanks rolling in, no gunfire raining down. Instead, there was music, cheering, and the low murmur of reunions beginning. Brothers saw sisters again. Parents held children who had grown into adults on the other side. Friends who had once lived on the same street found one another after decades of separation. The barrier that had once seemed permanent had yielded to a single night of confusion, courage, and collective will. In the months that followed, official decisions caught up with what people had already made real. Borders remained open, guard towers emptied. Heavy machinery moved in to dismantle concrete sections of the wall. Some pieces were preserved as memorials. Others were sent to museums or sold as symbols of freedom. On October 3rd, 1990, less than a year after that November night, East and West Germany were formally reunified. The country became one again. Berlin would eventually reclaim its role as the capital. Reunification, however, did not erase all divisions. People who had lived in the West and people who had lived in the East carried different experiences and memories. They had grown up under different rules, with different freedoms and fears. Stereotypes formed on both sides. Some East Germans felt overlooked or misunderstood. Some West Germans struggled to grasp what life under constant surveillance had been like. Transforming two systems into one took time, patience, and a willingness to listen. Even so, the city changed. Areas once occupied by the death strip became parks, roads, and train lines. The Brandenburg Gate, once standing in a closed-off zone, turned into a symbol of unity and celebration. On anniversaries, lights and projections now wash across its stone surface. Walking through modern Berlin, you can follow a line of cobblestones marking where the wall once stood. Plaques give names and dates for those who died trying to cross. Sections of the original barrier still stand, covered not by propaganda but by art, a gallery of murals from around the world. Children who visit these remnants today often find it hard to imagine a time when their city was sealed by concrete. They run and play where watchtowers once cast long shadows, yet the memory of the wall remains important. It is a reminder of what fear and division can build, and what persistence and hope can undo. The story of Berlin and its wall is not only about separation, it is about resilience, courage, and the quiet determination of ordinary people who refused to accept that a line of stone should decide the future of their lives. The wall has gone, but its lessons remain, whispered in the streets where people now walk freely, and in the gentle truth that no wall, no matter how high, can stand forever against a shared longing to be together. The voice of wood and string, a history of the violin. Before the violin became the elegant instrument we recognize today, with its graceful curves and warm, expressive voice, it began in forms far simpler and more ancient. Its earliest ancestors were carved from gourds, wooden bowls or hollowed shells, strung with animal gut and played with fingers or rudimentary bows. These early stringed instruments existed across many cultures, each shaped by the sounds its people valued, the materials at hand, and the stories they carried in their music. In the Middle East and parts of northern Africa, instruments like the rebab emerged, small and round-bodied, played against the chest or knee. Its voice was thin and haunting, carrying melodies across marketplaces, desert paths, and quiet gatherings. Along the Silk Road, musicians travelled with similar instruments, spreading techniques, styles, and ideas. Over centuries, these early stringed instruments crossed borders, cultures, and traditions. In Europe, medieval minstrels carried fiddles that varied from region to region. Some were rectangular, others oval. Some had flat backs, others curved. They were held on the arm, against the chest, or even supported by the legs. These instruments were used in dances, feasts, ceremonies, and folk celebrations. Nothing was standardized, and nothing yet resembled the polished violin that would one day take shape. But the seeds were planted. The idea of drawing a bow across stretched strings had taken hold. Over time, luthiers began experimenting with shapes that could amplify sound more efficiently. The evolution was slow, not a single invention, but a gradual refinement, spanning generations. Then, in northern Italy, during the early modern period, something remarkable happened. The violin appeared. In the towns of Cremona and Brescia, skilled craftsmen began creating instruments that combined beauty and acoustic brilliance. The early violin had 4 strings, an arched body, elegant F-holes, and a curved bridge. It was held on the arm, not the shoulder, and played with shorter bows than those used today. One of the first great makers was Andrea Amati of Cremona. He created instruments with delicately shaped outlines and varnish that glowed in rich shades of amber and gold. His violins were admired for their clarity and balance. Some were even made for royalty, decorated with painted coats of arms and symbols of prestige. As the Amati family refined their craft, the violin spread throughout Europe. It found its way into courts, churches, and public gatherings. People were drawn to its expressive range. It could sound playful or mournful, bright or shadowed. It could lead an ensemble or weave quietly within a group. But the violin's golden age had only just begun. In the next generation, 2 names would transform the instrument forever: Guarneri and Stradivari. Antonio Stradivari, born in Cremona, dedicated his life to perfecting the violin. His instruments became masterpieces, not only of craftsmanship, but of acoustic engineering. Each piece of maple and spruce was selected with care, carved with precision, and finished with varnish that still fascinates scientists today. The exact formula remains a subject of mystery and debate. Whether the secret lies in the varnish, the wood, or the maker's intuition, no one has ever fully replicated the tone of a Stradivari violin. His instruments possess a sound that carries across concert halls with astonishing clarity. They can whisper or soar, cutting through orchestras with a voice both robust and delicate. Musicians often describe playing a Stradivari violin as a conversation, as if the instrument itself responds with its own personality. Across town, the Guarneri family crafted instruments with darker, richer voices. Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù, in particular, created violins known for their power and emotional depth. Some musicians prefer the intensity of a Guarneri to the refinement of a Stradivari. Both styles shaped the future of violin music. By the 18th century, the violin had become a central instrument in European music. Composers wrote concertos, sonatas, and chamber works that showcased its expressive abilities. The violin began to carry stories, emotions, and human experiences through sound. Audiences were captivated by the instrument's ability to weep, laugh, dance, or linger on a note with almost human longing. As musical tastes shifted, so did the instrument itself. The violin of the Baroque era differed from the modern violin in several subtle but important ways. The fingerboard was shorter and angled differently. The bridge was flatter, affecting the curvature of the strings. Gut strings produced warm, intimate tones. The bow was lighter and curved outward, creating a softer, articulating effect. When orchestras grew larger in the classical and romantic periods, the violin had to adapt. To project sound over bigger ensembles and into grander concert halls, the instrument needed more power. The neck was lengthened and set at a sharper angle. Stronger, higher tension strings replaced some of the original gut. The bass bar inside the body was reinforced, allowing the violin to withstand greater pressure. Bows evolved as well. François Tourté, a French bowmaker, developed the modern bow with a concave curve, offering greater control and dynamic range. This allowed violinists to play with more force, subtlety, and flexibility. While the silhouette remained the same, the instrument's voice changed. The modern violin became brighter, more brilliant, and capable of conveying dramatic emotion. Through these changes, one thing stayed constant. The violin remained a storyteller. Its voice could shift with the times while carrying centuries of tradition beneath the surface of each note. The violin also travelled far from the concert halls of Europe. Its adaptability made it welcome in countless musical traditions around the world. In Eastern Europe, it became essential to folk music. It sang through village dances, weddings and celebrations, often played with spirited ornamentation that echoed across hills and fields. Romani musicians carried the violin across borders, infusing it with expressive slides and improvisations. In Ireland and Scotland, the violin transformed into the fiddle. Here, the music was fast, rhythmic, and lively, accompanying reels, jigs, and gatherings in homes and pubs. Fiddlers developed techniques unique to their traditions, playing in styles that encouraged spontaneity and community. In the Middle East and North Africa, the violin adapted once again. Musicians tuned it differently, drawing out microtones and expressive bends that mirrored the inflections of the human voice. In these regions, the violin became a vessel for both joy and deep emotional longing. In the Caribbean and the Americas, the violin joined local dances and folk traditions. In early American frontier music, it became the leading voice of settlers who gathered in small cabins or open fields to dance, celebrate, and tell stories. Wherever it travelled, the violin blended with local rhythms and customs. It became a cultural chameleon, able to carry classical refinement or rustic warmth depending on the hands that held it. Some instruments gain meaning through rarity or craftsmanship. The violin, however, gained something deeper, a kind of mythology. Many great violins carry names, personalities, and histories of their own. The most famous Stradivari violins have travelled from monarchs to virtuosos to collectors. They have crossed seas, survived wars, been stolen, recovered and played on stages where audiences held their breath at the first note. One violin, known as the Messiah, remained untouched and unplayed for centuries, preserved as though its maker had just finished carving it. Another, the soil, has been played by renowned musicians who speak of it with reverence, describing its voice as alive. Stories circulate of violins that seemed cursed, passing misfortune from one owner to another. Others are believed to hold parts of the souls of those who played them, their voices deepening with each generation. The material is simple: wood, glue, varnish, yet the spirit of the violin feels far greater than its parts. Perhaps it is the way it responds so intimately to the human body. A violinist does not simply press keys or pluck strings. They breathe with the instrument. They guide it with subtle shifts of muscle and attention. The violin becomes almost an extension of the player's inner state. This closeness gives the violin a uniquely personal quality. No two instruments sound the same, and even a single violin changes character depending on who holds it. Because of this, the violin has been called the voice of the human soul, capable of tenderness, sorrow, hope, or fire. The violin's journey from ancient stringed ancestors to modern concert halls is a story of evolution shaped by craftsmanship, culture, and emotion. It is also a story of patience. No violin is quick to make. Each one begins with a luthier selecting wood, tapping it to hear how it resonates, carving it carefully, layer by layer. Spruce becomes the top plate, maple becomes the back, ribs, and neck. Ebony forms the fingerboard. Everything must align with precision. The arch of the body, the thickness of the wood, the placement of the F-holes. Each decision shapes the sound. Varnish is applied slowly, allowing layers to settle and breathe. The scroll is carved by hand, not for sound, but as a signature of the maker's skill and personality. When the strings are tightened for the first time, the instrument awakens, releasing a voice that will continue to grow and mature for decades. A well-made violin improves with age. Wood dries and hardens. Vibrations from playing loosen internal fibers, allowing sound to travel more freely. Instruments played often become warm, resonant, and nuanced. A violin left untouched grows stiff and hollow. In this way, the violin is more than an object. It is a partnership between time, hands, and sound. Today, the violin remains one of the most beloved instruments in the world. It leads orchestras, carries the melody in quartets, and brings energy to folk bands. It bridges cultures, eras, and genres. A single violin can fill a hall with shimmering brilliance, or whisper a quiet melody that feels as though it is speaking directly to one listener. It can carry sadness, joy, longing, or triumph. Its voice has traveled from ancient desert paths to palaces, fields, concert halls, and recording studios. Even now, makers study the secrets of the old masters, trying to understand how wood, varnish, and human intuition combine to create instruments of unmatched beauty. Scientists scan violins with lasers and imaging tools, measuring vibrations and densities. Musicians attempt blind tests, comparing modern instruments with the revered creations of the past. Yet, the most mysterious quality of the violin remains something science cannot quantify. It is the way a simple combination of wood and string can stir emotion, conjure memories, or soothe the restless mind. The violin endures because it speaks a language older than words. And like all enduring stories, its song continues, alive in concert halls, whispered in practice rooms, drifting through open windows at dusk, or carried gently through headphones in the quiet of the night.